So my name is Michael Lebenek. I'm a senior developer advocate with AWS Mobile, and I'm going to talk a little bit about hybrid and web apps using AWS Mobile Hub. We're also going to introduce a new CLI tool that was pushed out about last week for AWS Mobile. Just to get an idea, how many of you are familiar with AWS Mobile Hub? And has anybody used it for developing mobile apps? So not too many, okay. So I'm going to start a little bit with some stats. So this is the latest kind of ComScore index for the apps that the most penetration in the App Store. So Facebook, obviously top, and these are partially also like the most opened apps on people's devices. And the main thing I'm kind of pointing out here is that these apps are hybrid apps. So Facebook is the developer of React and React Native, and they've ported these apps to be built with React Native. So pretty strong production scale applications using hybrid development tools. AWS Mobile Hub in general, we have a good amount of production level mobile applications running now using AWS Mobile Hub. And Mobile Hub in general is, if you're familiar with, is people in general familiar with CloudFormation? So AWS Mobile Hub is kind of like CloudFormation for mobile apps. It actually runs CloudFormation in the background, but enables you to create popular features for your mobile app, things like push notifications, measuring analytics, testing with device farm, things like that with clicks in the console. So the service doesn't cost anything. It's an orchestration service. You just pay for the resources that it creates. And what the CLI is going to allow you to do now is, instead of going into Mobile Hub and clicking on things in the console and you get a NoSQL database or a cloud API using Cloud Logic, you can now do that so originally you would do this by clicking in the console, selecting features, and enabling them in this way. And what you can get through this now recently with Mobile Hub is much more JavaScript-friendly functionality. Traditionally, Mobile Hub has been very geared towards native app development, and we've recently released a lot of features in regards to JavaScript development. So when you enable Mobile Hub, you'll get JavaScript files for exporting constants, like all your settings configurations, similarly to the way you would get a configuration JSON file when you generate a native app. So the CLI is available on NPM. You just do an NPM install of the AWS Mobile. You create an app. The AWS Mobile doesn't really care what the app is. The app could be a React app, it could be a vanilla JavaScript app, it could be an Ionic app. You just create whatever app you're going to be creating, and then you do this AWS Mobile init command. So what this basically does is initializes everything you saw on that previous slide in the background. It takes usually a few seconds, and you have your entire backend. So it's pretty powerful in regards to starting a new application, and especially for prototyping very rapidly. So when you do this init, you have your entire backend. You can start wiring it up with services. So one of the features is hosting and streaming. And with hosting and streaming, you get an S3 bucket, and you get a CloudFront distribution. So whether you went in the console and you clicked on hosting and streaming and enabled it, you get an S3 bucket provisioned, you get a CloudFront distribution provisioned, all automatically. So similarly, with hosting and streaming on the CLI, you can enable it via the CLI, and you simply run an AWS Mobile Publish command once you enable the feature, and all your code is automatically pushed up to an S3 bucket. So traditionally what you do with this is use something like Grunt or Gulp, or depending on what your tooling is, you can kind of tool this up. The AWS Mobile CLI gives you the ability to just configure it, and it will automatically use your AWS CLI credentials in your home directory. If you have the AWS CLI installed, it will pull from that, and it also comes with a configure command. So you can configure it with separate credentials if you want, but it's going to automatically pull those credentials from your AWS CLI and work with the AWS account you have configured with that. So this is an example of refreshing a CloudFront distribution. You can, whenever you run publish, there's various arguments. So if you just initialize, say, a React app and you have it as a web app, never mind a mobile app, and you just have a web application built in React, you can do your changes, run the AWS Mobile Publish command, and pass an argument to refresh the entire CloudFront distribution. So traditionally, what you would do, even if you had this hosting and streaming feature enabled, is you'd go into whether you're using the CLI or not, or CloudFormation, you'd have to run a stack update, or you'd have to go into the console and go to the CloudFront distribution and do an invalidation on all the files in there. Whether you tool that up or not, it's a cumbersome process, can be a cumbersome process when updating code, and the CLI completely eliminates that with one argument. You can also test on device farm now. So with AWS in Mobile Hub, you don't actually have to pass the -T, it'll do it by default. You can also pass an argument to tell it not to test. Is everybody familiar with device farm? So AWS device farm is essentially a farm of mobile devices that we house, and different devices, popular devices that you can access remotely. We even have a remote, it's a tool that you can install on your Mac that will allow you to do an ADB connection directly to an Android device in AWS device farm and interact with it, just like you would as if you had a device plugged in USB to your computer. And it's great for testing, so it'll automate. They have what's called a fuzz test, which will just click all over the place, try to break your app. And it's great for easy, simple mobile device testing. And with the CLI, you could just simply pass this -T command, and you'll see the results in the console. You could also invoke API Gateway with the CLI, which is very powerful. Traditionally, with the adoption of serverless architectures, it's kind of become a little difficult because it's a newer thing to debug or invoke these things with like API Gateway and Lambda. So if you wanted to do this, you could do it in the console. Going into API Gateway, there's a kind of debugger built into there where you can invoke the APIs, but that doesn't really give you a way to work with it in terms of credentials and within your application, or if you're just creating a new API. So if you're doing, traditionally maybe do this with like Grunt or something to spin up an API Gateway or CloudFormation or SAM. Whether you do that or not, you can invoke these APIs directly from the CLI now and see the results immediately in your terminal. So it's great for creating new APIs, testing out APIs, and it's available as a feature on the CLI. You can also do post, get, put, all kinds of commands and see the results, pass JSON data right as an argument on the CLI, and see the results right there. So in terms of features, that really encompasses all the features that Mobile Hub in the console allows you to enable. So with analytics, you can use Amazon Pinpoint to enable analytics. Analytics is actually enabled by default now anytime you create a new Mobile Hub project, because analytics is pretty key to anything you're building out there. You need to know what's going on. So with the AWS Mobile CLI, you just pass a feature name and you do enable. You could pass a prompt argument and it'll run through questions if you want to customize it for things like user sign-in. If you're doing Amazon Cognito, you would maybe change the password policy or define if it's multi-factor authentication. You can now do all this via the CLI. So you can enable these with the feature name, and then you could simply just do an AWS mobile push, which I'll show you in a bit, to push up the configuration into the cloud, and your AWS Mobile Hub will be updated with these features. So saves a lot of time, great for rapid development, again, great for prototyping. If you're using the free tier, you can really start building and prototyping extremely fast doing this. So what we're going to talk about today more is a couple of the popular hybrid frameworks, React Native, React, and Ionic. Is anybody, who's built apps with React or React Native? So anybody Ionic? So decent amount. So we're going to get into some of using these frameworks with the AWS Mobile CLI. And so a little bit about React Native. It uses JSX, so it's more of a declarative JavaScript using the React framework for building native applications. It's available for Android and iOS, and it supports basic browser development support. So things like live reloading, debugging. You can debug React Native apps with the Chrome development tools, just like you would a web app. So it kind of gives you all these things that were available for web development traditionally that we're used to, when building native apps. And what React Native does pretty well is runs very fast. They have found a way to run kind of like a 60 frames per second on a hybrid app, so it really behaves more like a native app. And you can also use native features and UI components and things like that, along with JavaScript components. So what we have released a while ago was the AWS Mobile React Native Starter. So we've been releasing starter kits. Has anybody used the starter kits at all? A few people. So the starter kits are great for a full-blown application for a React Native app. So the React Native Starter in particular uses Amazon Cognito for authentication, Amazon S3 for user file storage, allows you to upload profile photos and automatically sync them. These are things that the CLI basically now automates. So what you would do here is AWS Mobile Hub supports import-export functionality. So when you have a Mobile Hub project, you can go into the console and export it, and that will give you a YAML file that basically defines your backend, similarly to how CloudFormation and SAM, the serverless application model, works. Now AWS Mobile will also give you a YAML file that defines your environment, so you could share it, you can put it into version control, and you can publish it to a GitHub repo. So similarly, there's Ionic has an official generator as well for AWS that supports this, but it's a great way to version control your backend for your mobile applications, as well as sharing the backend for your mobile applications, spinning them up in other regions and stuff like that. So this starter kit's available on GitHub publicly now. So I'm just going to jump into a demo specifically around React now. So React in general, the mobile CLI comes with built-in libraries for React. So there's components available to you, both HOC components, which are higher order components that are available as part of React that give you the ability to wrap your application in and execute common functionalities. So things like determining if a user is authenticated or not. We'll give you a component called with Authenticator that will wrap your application and show a login UI if the person isn't authenticated. And we also give you an entire canned UI for sign in and sign out, forgot password, MFA authentication, all built in and also themable. So in general, with the AWS Mobile Hub, I'm actually going to go through and just generate a new React app with what's called Create React App. And this is a tool, an open source tool that just creates applications, React applications on the command line. And with Create React App, you just run the command and it's going to generate a React application. It's going to download a bunch of libraries, do an npm install, and then give you basically a shell for a new React application. Once that's done, what you could do is run the AWS mobile init, which will initialize the backend, create an AWS mobile project, which I'll show you, and you'll basically end up with something like this. So this is AWS Mobile Hub. It is already initialized application. You can see I have messaging analytics. You click on this, you'll see analytics is enabled, and analytics is run by Amazon Pinpoint. When Amazon Pinpoint, you can do push notifications and user engagement as well. So immediately, right out of the box, your app is going to have the ability to see lifecycle events, when a user has opened the app, closed the app, when it was in the background, see things like sessions that are alive, different demographics. You could send a lot of events to Amazon Pinpoint and capture demographics, as well as do custom events, which could also mean session start, session stop, things like that. So while that loads, I'll go back here. Now, I also have user sign-in enabled here. So that's with Amazon Cognito. By running the user sign-in command, so now that this is done, I'll give you an idea here. So into the React app that was just created here. Let's just zoom in here. Now I would do an AWS mobile init. And it's going to ask me some questions. So this is based on your application and how it's set up. So since we don't really care what your application is, we're going to ask you a series of questions. So where's the source code? And they're going to default to kind of like the basic options that most apps like React or Ionic are going to, or other things will use, or standard practices like source and dist. But with Create React Native, it's actually build. So I'm going to change that to build, where my build artifacts are done when I do a build. And those are the files that will eventually get pushed up to S3. And then it'll actually ask for build commands, because the mobile CLI includes a run command, which you can use in place of things like npm start and stuff like this that will maintain your backend. And if there's changes to it, if you added a feature like sign in or you added analytics or API or Cloud Logic, you can do a AWS mobile run. Similarly to how like live reload works when you're programming, this will do a similar thing. It will enable live reload, and if you add features, it will automatically refresh your backend. So it's almost like live reload for AWS. So when you specify the build command, I'm just going to leave these all defaults, and test command, and then you could specify a name, and the name is just going to be what your application name is in AWS Mobile Hub, and it's going to default to just a generic name with a date timestamp. So once that's done and you run that command, it's actually going to create the AWS mobile backend. And AWS Mobile Hub in general is going to use CloudFormation to run a script. It's going to enable analytics. It's going to create an S3 bucket, so create a hosting and streaming option for you. And it's going to give you the option to download JavaScript configuration files. So with that one command, I'll now have more or less a fully configured AWS backend, especially in regards to prototyping. So now you can start building your app using analytics, sign-in, storage, upload photos, profiles, things like that. And then you can enable more features. So with that initial app there, I'll basically have if I can find it, one of these. So now if you want to run this, you would just use AWS Mobile Run. And what this is actually going to do, what the AWS Mobile CLI also does, is it includes the AWS Amplify library. Then the AWS Amplify library is a ES6 style JavaScript library that wraps the AWS SDK and provides standard ES6 type TypeScript interfaces to interact with AWS. You're gonna import it into your application, and you're gonna enable things, work with things like analytics. You're gonna configure it with the AWS exports file that AWS Mobile Hub just downloaded for me. So instead of going into the Mobile Hub console, I basically don't even have to go into the console. I can see my exports files here. So this is everything that Mobile Hub generated, that the AWS CLI, Mobile CLI generated for me. You can see I have analytics enabled. I have a whole bunch of constants that were automatically defined for me and pulled down. So now this file isn't made for editing or anything, and you generally don't want to commit it as well, because the CLI will maintain it. It's kind of like a configuration file for your application, and it can get compiled into your app when you build it and you publish it to S3. So it's going to contain all the endpoints, the features. And the Amplify library will use this to determine what to call with things like sign-in, or if you're using Amazon Pinpoint for push notifications even, or Amazon DynamoDB. So if I do a run command on this project, it's just going to run the command that I specified before. It's going to retrieve, let's see if I can zoom in here. It's going to retrieve the AWS exports backend, the AWS exports file that we just looked at, the latest one for me. It's going to run an npm install, which will include the Amplify library, and then it's going to run my application. So here you can see it's just a basic React app. If you did create React app, any question?
I didn't see how you bound your
ID?
Yeah, so this is your account page.
Sure, yeah. So so the way that it determines your credentials for AWS account is it uses the AWS CLI that you either have installed on your machine, or you would run an AWS mobile configure command similarly to the AWS CLI, and you'll see it's going to ask me here for my access key, my secret key, etc. So right now you can see it has values in there, and that's because it's just pulling it from my CLI. So if you have the CLI installed, you don't have to really do anything. It's going to use the default configuration for the CLI, but you can run this command, and it is going to maintain a separate directory as well. So if you're familiar with the AWS CLI, it's going to have something like this in your home directory, this AWS directory, and that's going to have your config and your credentials. The AWS Mobile CLI, similarly on Windows, will read from these. It'll read these credentials and configuration from here. And it's also going to maintain a project one, which is the one you saw me run, that you can use to override it, basically. So that app I just built, which is somewhere, let me just run again, is a new app that is going to have if you look at the package JSON, you'll see it's automatically added for me, the AWS Amplify library. So I'm going to show you a little bit of that now that that's added that. So the basic workflow here is I'm going to create a new web application or mobile hybrid application with my own choice of tooling. So I'm either going to use React, React Native, Ionic, tool something up yourself. Then you're going to run AWS Mobile Init inside that project directory, and possibly a configure if you do not have the CLI installed. Then you're ready to go. So what you would do next is you would do AWS Mobile. If you just run the command here, you'll get some help. So you'll want to add features. So you can run AWS Mobile Features to see what you currently have for features in here. So it's going to also give me the option to pick features on the CLI. So right now I have analytics and hosting enabled. So what does that look like? So if my internet is going to work. So the hosting and streaming, you'll see that was enabled. Gives me the option to view from S3 my application, which is going to give you a generic one right now, or view from CloudFront. And that's all built when you do AWS Mobile Init and a publish. Now, you can also see there's an AWS config here and AWS exports. These files are automatically generated for you and maintained by AWS Mobile Hub, but you can also download them and include them in other apps, or they're going to contain the information for your application to connect to these services for you. So now I have an S3 bucket, CloudFront distribution, and analytics enabled in this application. Now, say I wanted to enable something like user sign-in with Cognito. I can just check that box, and now I have user sign-in, and I'd want to do an AWS Mobile push. Now that's going to push up the configuration up there, and then I could do an AWS Mobile run and start working with sign-in. So AWS Mobile CLI is going to work with your backend. The AWS Amplify library is going to work with your front end. It's a 100% front-end JavaScript framework library. Sorry. So now that that's done, it's going to retrieve the latest AWS exports for me, because that's going to be different. It's now going to include Amazon Cognito information in it for user pool ID, identity pool IDs, and things like that. And if I refresh here, if I'm in the right app, I'm not. I'll see Amazon Cognito enabled. I think it's this one. So now I have user sign-in enabled. So that's what that command did, and I'll have a default configuration up here for email and password. I didn't choose the prompt option, so the prompt option would give me the ability to choose, do I want a different sign-in method? Do I want username? Do I want email? Multi-factor authentication is disabled here. I could enable it. Minimum password length. These types of options, or you could just do that one command and get a default configuration. So similarly, let's run this again. And I'll enable user files. So what user files is going to do is give me the ability to work with private assets for users. So it's going to create S3 bucket policies and information for people to be able to upload things like profile pictures or private data to that user. I can upload, as a user, after I log in, I can upload a profile picture that's going to automatically go to an S3 bucket that is only for me, so nobody else. So user files also uses S3. So now, if I refresh here, you'll see now I have this user data storage option in Mobile Hub. If I click on that, I'll just see that there's an option to either require it or not. That's really all it is. But now my users can go in, they can, maybe I have a profile page and I have a picture, I want to upload a picture. You can tool that up now with the Amplify library. So let's take a look at Cloud API. So Cloud API is going to give you the ability to run API Gateway with Lambda functions. So with that, now what you can do is, let's do AWS Mobile Push. So now what you'll be able to do is write backend code using a standard REST API and interact with it again you can interact with it with either the Amplify library, which makes it a lot easier, or you can even just use the vanilla AWS JavaScript library or a browser build where you customize just these features. It's really up to you. And you can see it's also giving me here is the CloudFormation status, so I can see as the stack is being created in the back end. So for this particular feature, it's going to enable API Gateway and Lambda, so it's going to take a little bit of time. But eventually, let's see if it shows up here. You'll see I have this Cloud Logic box now available. And if you click in here, you'll see the APIs that are being deployed. So that's creating an API Gateway, a distribution, a stage for that, and everything. And it's also creating a sample API for me. Which if you do the prompt option, you can customize this a bit more. This gives you a great way to get started prototyping and things like that. That should be about done. So let's go to a new tab. So the last option here is databases. What databases is going to do is enable a NoSQL database using Amazon DynamoDB. Let's see if I can do both at the same time. So now I have a NoSQL database here enabled. Oops. That's going to be running for a little while there probably. So similarly, let's see where this is at. Yeah, so it doesn't like doing multiple at the same time. So let's take a look at what I can do now with these features enabled. So the AWS Mobile CLI is going to maintain a directory in your project. I have a completed project here to take a look at, and this is just a vanilla React app that's been created with Create React App. Now, if you look in app.js, I have a bunch of things enabled here. So what you mainly do here is include the Amplify library, use this track lifecycle, which is going to actually track the lifecycle of this React application and send the data to Amazon Pinpoint. So now I can get things like session start, session end. It's going to track when people are using my app and when they leave, so I could start capturing some data and metrics around that. And now I have the exports file. So the exports file is what you saw was pulled here. So let's run one more time. Features. So now we have all these enabled. And whenever you enable or disable something, you'll see it will pull a new exports file for me. So it's going to update the backend, and then it's going to pull a new AWS exports file for me. So now you'll import that into your application, and you'll configure the Amplify library with it. That's really all you need to do to get started. So if you've ever used, has anybody used the AWS JavaScript SDK in web applications? How many people have used that? So not too many. So there's a lot of features to it, but it can be cumbersome configuring all those. If you're using things like Cognito, it gives you a lot of flexibility. If you're just using more standard functionality, you can now use the Amplify library to make that a lot simpler. So just running these a few lines of code, you can now get analytics pushed to the console. With Amazon Pinpoint, you'll see campaign data, you'll see custom events if you want to send them. And you also, in terms of auth, you have the ability to get current sessions, do different things based on that, set state. How many people are familiar with React? So a good amount, cool. And what you'll see, let me just run this so you can get an idea of what we're looking at here. So when you do the AWS Mobile Run command, it's going to do an npm install in case you've added new features or not initially. And then it's going to retrieve the latest exports file. And then it's going to basically run the command that you specify. So if you had specified npm start or similar command, it's going to run that. And then it's going to open in your browser. So let's let that go. So this is an example of the application. I currently have a user session. So this UI here, you see hello and sign out. I'm already logged into this. So if I log out of here, this entire UI that you see is completely canned into the library. So it's giving me this UI, and I've also styled it because I'm using this material style library. So I want it to kind of look like that. So you can pass a React file into it and define standard styling along with it. Now this was all given to me by the Amplify library and by doing AWS Mobile enable user sign-in. So now I forgot password, I have sign up. If I do a login here, it's actually going to ask me for MFA. So it's going to ask me to confirm my code. This was all done with one command line command. You also see messaging and analytics here. I'll get my code here. So the code was actually text message to me, so I have that enabled instead of email. Now I'm logged in. So it's a little hard to see, but when you do log in, I show a few more options here. So these cards weren't shown by default. They were hidden because I wasn't logged in. And that's an example of using the higher order components or the authenticator component that's built into the Amplify library. But this is allowing me to send custom events. So key value pairs, I could send that, and you'll eventually see those in Amazon Pinpoint. It doesn't take too long. Generally with Amazon Pinpoint, it's up to a minute at most. And then you'll see I also have CloudLogic here. So with CloudLogic enabled, I can now run REST requests. So enabling the Cloud API now gives me ability to just run simply with Amplify get post commands, delete commands, and it's all using API Gateway and Lambda. So these are the basic APIs that I created, and you'll see I'll get the result here in the box here, and that's just using standard React code. And I just ran a get command on my Cloud API that I created with AWS Mobile CLI, and I also have it set up for private API as well. So the private API is only going to let me run API calls while I'm logged in. So if I do a similar command while not logged in, I would actually get an error there and it wouldn't work. And it's storing my Cognito identity pool ID here as well. So this essentially was completely and 100% all automated for me, running a couple CLI commands and using the Amplify library. The other thing you see here is storage. So what I could do here is pick a photo. Let's see if I could find one. And it's going to upload that photo for me. I look at the network, you'll see here. And then it's going to show the photo there for me. So that's also a private image to my user as logged in. And you can see the network requests that were done here as well. So let's jump over to here, take a look at this. So this is what the project looks in AWS Mobile Hub. If you click on NoSQL database, you'll see I have this NoSQL database that was created for me. It's using a partition key of user ID, and it's all configured for me. So I didn't have to go in and create a DynamoDB database. I didn't have to figure out what my hash key should be if I want it to be private data or public data. You really can just focus on front-end development and not worry about any of the back end and ensure that it's being done with best practices and things like that when it's configured. So let's run through a little bit of what this looks like as far as these components go. So you can see here there's an authenticator component, and there's a specific library that's available just for React called AWS Amplify React. And this will enable me to display that user sign-in component that you saw that lets me log in, forget password, confirm code, all those things. You can also tool those yourself with the Amplify library if you want to. You don't have to use the canned component, but it is pretty customizable. You'll see here I have a theme enabled, and this theme allows me to fully customize it. So instead of tooling all that up, I found it easier to just use that. And then you'll see here I'm just rendering this authenticator component, and that's giving me this entire sign-in, sign-out UI that we saw over here. So it's giving me a greeting. You can also customize the greeting. So that's an entire login, logout from CLI to initialization to update the backend to actually tooling it in your application. So the other thing you'll see here is, in addition to the themes, you'll see the state change. So the state change is going to fire anytime state changes within authentication. So it's very useful for tracking authentication state, knowing when somebody's logged in or logged out, and passing it around in your application. There's also the HOC components included in the higher order components, which can wrap your application and do all of this for you if you don't want to deal with any of it. But this event will fire, and you'll see I have an argument here for props because this card is actually just rendered here in my list as a login card, and I'm passing it my AWS exports, which has all my configuration data, and I'm passing it this function on auth state change. And what that's doing is I'm also saying I don't want to show myself or user files for people to upload stuff or for running CloudLogic APIs unless I'm logged in. So it gives you the ability to do that, fire events. In terms of uploading files, this can sometimes be cumbersome as well. So we have the ability to import these components. One of them is called S3 image. S3 image is going to let you upload. Simply adding this one line of code gives you this entire functionality. So similarly to the login, logout, it's a canned component that literally gives you the entire the file upload experience. And that will fire events and everything, so you could track progress and things like that. There's also an album component, which will let you manage multiple images. There's just the picker component, so you can kind of pick and choose which components you want in the library, or you can just use these completely baked ones, which give you the entire UI, especially for things like file upload. And that's using the user storage you saw here that we enabled. So in terms of analytics, using Amazon Pinpoint, you can send custom data to Amazon Pinpoint. Let's see if my console is working. Not really. So these custom events, I'm already familiar with, ever used Amazon Mobile Analytics? So with Amazon Pinpoints contains all of those features for things like demographical information, or you can also send custom events. So these events could be whatever you want. They could be user uploaded a file. They could be user edited a profile. They're more meaningful to your application. And all you do is run this one command to send these events. And what the library will do is actually queue up these events for you. It's not going to post them up, brute force up every time you run this command. It's actually going to put it in a queue, and it's going to run it every so often and update the events in Pinpoint. So a little bit about API. So the Cloud API feature that I enabled, now I can run REST APIs in my application very easily, which if you've ever used API Gateway with exporting the JavaScript SDK, there's a lot going on there. So this simplifies it pretty heavily and gives me the ability to simply run a command to invoke APIs. So this is just passing up a DynamoDB item update in this example, using some of the input information you saw here, and it's running the Cloud API. So one command line API, now I can run REST APIs authenticated as well. And you'll see I can pass the result and use all the React ability to use asynchronous operations, which is native to React, so I can wait for the asynchronous operation to complete, get my data, and bind it to state and do things like loading, all with a few lines of code. So heavily simplifies the entire process of enabling and integrating these features. It's really a whole story around doing not just enabling your backend or configuring your backend with a few command line commands, but also now actually using them in your application in a meaningful way. So let's see. So similarly to React, there is also some separate React Native components. So with React Native, you actually can import a specific React Native library, which is going to allow you to do the same sort of things, the same sign-in, the same login, the same UI is going to be available to you, the same analytics services, all just within React Native instead. You'll see it's basically doing the exact same thing. So the code is completely the same, whether it's React or React Native. You're just going to import a different library because the React Native is going to do a little more work on the native side to do things like signing requests to improve performance. So I'm going to jump back here. So in addition to React Native, we also have an Ionic Starter as well. So with the AWS Ionic Starter is actually, you can see it's by the Ionic team. So they have something within their CLI that lets you generate AWS apps, and it has all the features built into it for user sign-in, for adding items to DynamoDB, for doing all these things. Now with AWS CLI, you can actually just generate a generic Ionic app and use the AWS Mobile init command into any Ionic app. But this application is also available on GitHub for a full-blown kind of AWS app with Ionic. And you don't need to really do anything if you're using Ionic. You just use the Ionic CLI with the start command. Let's see if it gives me help. So you would give it your app name. Actually, let me get out of here. So if you do Ionic start, Ionic app, and then you just give it this flag AWS, that will actually pull down a template that was created by Ionic for AWS Mobile Hub specifically. So what that does is it will also pull down the zip file that is for AWS Mobile Hub, which I talked about earlier, for that one-click deployment. And you can simply import that into your AWS Mobile Hub backend. So you go import here. You'll drag that zip file into the AWS Mobile Hub console, and the entire backend will be created for you. So that's a way to kind of share code similarly to some of like CloudFormation templates for mobile backends. So once your app is generated here with Ionic, you can start doing the same sort of thing. So AWS Mobile Init, it's going to run through, again, exactly the same questions. So with Ionic, I'm actually going to give it the root directory. I'm going to give it the www directory, and then I'm going to leave these blank. And you see the name that's generated by Mobile Hub. Now it's going to create my back end, and it's going to give me the messaging and analytics built in, and I can start building it similarly with the Amplify library or whatever you want. But at this point, now you're ready to go, and you could do similar things to AWS Mobile Features to enable features like user sign-in. So two different frameworks, basically the same exact CLI commands to enable all of AWS features in the back end for your mobile app. So that's pretty much it. I guess at this point we could go through any questions you have. And thanks. Yeah. What was the question? For building apps, so like Ionic and React, you're talking about? Oh yeah, Vue. So you can generate, like I said, so the question was other libraries for building hybrid apps, mobile web apps. So you can use really whatever you want. The Ionic and React Native are pretty popular. There's also, you can use Vue. It depends kind of what you're targeting. So if you're targeting like a PWA app or a progressive web app, using things like Ionic and stuff like that make it easy because they include a service worker. They have generators built in. You can essentially just have a directory and start writing code yourself. Or if you use Vue or Ember.js will work. You just have to run that AWS Mobile init command from within that directory, answer the questions that it asks you. Where's your source code? Where's your build directory? Those are pretty key because your source code is where AWS Mobile is going to initialize the features, and your build code is what it's going to push up to the cloud when you run the AWS Mobile publish command. So it doesn't matter what library you use, but generally we see a lot of React Native and Ionic usage for building these things.
Does AWS Mobile or Device Farm or any of that ecosystem contain the step where it can put it in the App Store or the Amazon store for you?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. AWS Mobile Hub doesn't do that.
Okay, so at the end you still need to take your exporting package and upload it into Amazon yourself.
So it depends what you're doing. So if you're doing a web app, you don't have to do anything because you would generally host that on S3 or CloudFront, or if you're using the CLI, you would do the publish command and it's up there. And you can use Route 53 as well to point DNS over to the CloudFront distribution for your own domain. But if you're doing App Store, then you would have to build the APKs or the IPAs and submit them to the App Store. It doesn't automate any of that. You can install them in Device Farm and run tests.
Export the APKs at the end.
That's depending on your tooling. So if you're using Ionic, Ionic will do that using Cordova. So Ionic will do a build, and when you build an Ionic app, you're going to give it what platforms you want, Android, iOS, and then it will build the APK or the IPA for you. So, but it depends on your tooling, you know. So, yeah.
Have you set up using AWS Mobile init for a React Native app that's created using Create React Native app?
Sure. Yeah, you can. Yep. So if you do that, you just have to run if you use it depends on the features that you're going to use. So if you're going to use sign-in, you have to eject it from the Create React Native app because it needs to install a native module. So the native component it needs to use for the Amazon Cognito signing for the big integer signing. It has to use the native platform for that because platforms like iOS don't allow certain things, and performance-wise for using things like the big integer, it performs better on native. So with React Native, you would actually eject it if you're going to use sign-in. Otherwise, you can just use the web portion.
Is it possible to integrate sign-in with the existing RDS database?
So, no, not with the CLI or the Amplify library, because you would have your own database. The features that are available in the AWS Mobile CLI are specifically Amazon Cognito. So those work directly with user pools and identity. But technically, sure, you could tool up a REST API if you want. If you use something like Amazon, like API Gateway, you could tool something up to proxy over to RDS. API Gateway has a service proxy that you can use, so then you could still use the Cloud API functionality and maybe customize it a bit for a service proxy.
How do you protect access to your APIs from other apps, especially if you have a hybrid app or you're launching some web app? People can see your APIs. How do you restrict access to people taking those and building
Sure.
an app using your backend?
Yeah, so how that's done is with IAM, AWS IAM, and what it does is you have different roles in IAM. So IAM has in particular, every service has roles within AWS. The roles, at the simplest basic form that's been around a while, is like with EC2. If you launch an instance with EC2 and you give it a role, that EC2 instance will only be able to do what that role defines. Now, that role can define calling S3 or uploading an object to S3, and that's it. If that EC2 tried to do anything else, it wouldn't work. It would fail. Similarly, with API Gateway, has an invoke role and an execute role, and those roles determine what it can do. And you can also specify if the API is private, only available to signed-in users. That's what I did there. So if I signed out, I just didn't want to get my authentication code again. But if I sign out of this thing here, And I don't even think I need to refresh, but I will. It's not running. But if I log out of there and try to do an API call, it's not going to work. It's going to say failed authentication. So those are done with roles that are basically automated for you with the CLI, but you can also customize them within IAM. If you go into IAM, you can edit the invoke role and the execute role. And those are two roles for API Gateway in particular. It's invoking APIs, just invoking an API, or executing a Lambda function or something. So what is that API doing? It's two different things. API Gateway has a lot of security involved that's extremely flexible. It can get very complicated too, but there's a lot of ways to do it. You can include custom authorizers within API Gateway, so you can pass your own headers and determine. There's a lot of ways to do it, but the simplest way is using the roles with API Gateway, invoke and execute roles, specifically invoke role. What's that?
The default API created is based on IAM-based authorization?
Yeah. Yep. So it's going to have default roles for invoke and execute. Depending on what you do, because if you have it executing a Lambda function, it's going to have to execute that Lambda function. So that's really what it does mainly right now.
And do you have a flexibility in the command line to change the API authorization?
Not too much with the authorization piece. You would not on the CLI. But if you went into, if you go into the console, you can customize the API Gateway, or you can do it with Mobile Hub with the YAML file, CloudFront, however you want to do it.
Segregate the production and development data, would you just update that config file that you showed us and then just check it out?
Yeah, I would say you probably want to do like probably two Mobile Hub apps maybe. There's a lot of different ways you could do it. But if you probably want two Mobile Hub apps, because essentially in the background that's going to be two CloudFront distros, which you would generally do anyway. So that would give you two different export files. I mean, there's other ways you can do it, but that's probably a good way to do it.
Tools to integrate with Internet of Things, is that part of AWS Mobile?
IoT isn't in the AWS Mobile CLI or as a feature in it right now. Yeah. It isn't right now. I'm not sure what the roadmap is, if we're going to enable it. Those are kind of two different realms. So you can essentially enable IoT if you wanted to use like the MQTT messaging. You could do that, but it's not in Mobile Hub. Yeah.
So two things. Number one, I just wanted to verify, because I saw another box in there, that you could incorporate Lex and voice
Yep.
into your app. Is that right?
Yeah, so within, that's what the AWS Mobile CLI supports is the CLI specifically. So within Mobile Hub, if you create a new app and you say, I want to do a platform, or here, let's do it real quick. So you create a new application. This is essentially going to create a CloudFront distro for you. Now you choose your platform. So say you do just web, and you want to enable web hosting or React Native, whatever you want to do. So the CLI kind of automates all this for you. But there are other features you can, so now it's going to tell you to install the CLI, and you can start playing with it on the CLI. But once you enable that, you'll now be able to enable more features. So you do have conversational bots here, which will allow you to enable one. You can enable a generic one and just enable it. But you can't work with that on the CLI yet.
So my buddy really loves Angular. Can I let him know that
Oh, yeah.
John says that Angular is basically dead compared to React?
So Ionic uses Angular. So like I said, with this, so specifically with the Amplify library, there's another session I'm doing for that too. It's a dev chat tomorrow. But the Amplify library doesn't care. It just is ES6 syntax, so import and exports. But Angular works great. React works great. We just happen to have components pre-built with React right now. We'll be supporting more based on customer feedback. Yep. Yeah. Anybody else? No? All right, well, thanks a lot. I mean, I'll be around if you have more questions or anything, in regards to the CLI.